In today's lecture, we're going to continue our discussion on the nervous system. And today we're specifically going to focus on the brain as well as something called the cranial nerves. As always, these are the learning objectives that you want to make sure that you can execute today before you proceed to the next lecture. Make sure you can describe these, explain them, etc. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. Let's talk about protection and nourishment of the brain. So what are some introductory statistics about the brain before we talk specifically about protection and nourishment? So, well, that's sort of what the brain looks like. That's a nice sagittal slice, and you have a lateral view of that sagittal slice right now. And really, when we talk about the brain, the human brain, it's about 3 pounds, about 10 billion neurons. Remember, neurons are nerve cells. And what does the brain do? Well, pretty much everything, right? So it registers sensations, controls movements, basic functions like that. It has higher level functions like intellect, emotions, behavior, decision making, and then it does, again, basic things like regulations of breathing or heart rate, etc. So the brain really does everything, and the brain is a machine that really relies heavily on oxygen and nourishment, via the blood. Okay, so how's the brain protected? Let's focus about that first. Well, surrounding the brain we have the skull, right, that provides a very hard layer of protection, a bone layer of protection. But also the brain, deep to the skull, has 3 cranial things called meninges. And these meninges are continuous with the spinal cord, and there's 3 different types of meninges. So there's an hour later called the dura mater. Dura sounds like durable, so I think you want something durable on the outside to protect it. The next layer or tissue inside is called the arachnoid matter. And then finally, the inner layer is called the pia mater. And this is what they look like. So if you go ahead and focus on this picture on the bottom right, really what you're noticing here, if I pull out my pointer here, is you'll see that we have these 3 cranial meninges right here, right? Again, dura on the outside, arachnoid in the middle, and then pia is on the inside. And I always think if you're potty training a young child, I have young children, right? You would think you want them to pee in the toilet. In other words, pia is the inner layer, right? So I sort of think of that like pia in the toilet, pia inner layer. So you want to think of some goofy ways to remember that. So I think durable on the outside, dura on the outside, pee in the toilet, pee on the inside, and then you know that arachnoid matter is that inner layer. Between these layers, you have something called cerebral spinal fluid, and this adds to cushioning or protection of the brain. Okay, so what additional ways is the brain protected? Well, here we have to look at a brain here. We're going to see that we see these different structures inside. This is a right lateral view of the brain. On the right on the screen, right, we have the anterior view, perspective. On the left, we have the posterior side. Then if we go ahead and look at this, we see the spinal cord at the bottom. Right, as we move in the superior direction, we have things called ventricles. We have 2 lateral ventricles, and then we have something called the third ventricle, then we have something called the fourth ventricle. And really what these ventricles do is they contain that cerebral spinal fluid that's moving about, and it helps to nourish and protect the brain. And then there's other structures that are associated as well. So again, that cerebral spinal fluid just popped up on the top left here. That's something that's very important that we want to note. What does it do? Again, it flows in the subarachnoid space of the meninges, as well as the central canal of the spinal cord, something that runs through the spinal cord right down the middle, and then as well as these ventricles in the brain. And again, it helps aid in that layer of protection of the brain, protecting it against blows. It's produced by something called the choroid plexus, and you have a choroid plexus in basically each of these ventricles. Okay, so how does the cerebral spinal fluid circulate throughout the brain? Well, we have it here, and there's a certain pattern in which it circulates, and it's indicated by the chart here on the right. And so really I want to note, it looks like a complicated chart, but if you look at it this way, if you say the lateral ventricles, right, have those choroid plexuses, or plexuses that you see on the top right here, they produce cerebral spinal fluid that goes into the lateral ventricles, okay? Then if we look at this next sort of row down, the third ventricle, its choroid plexus produces cerebral spinal fluid that goes to the third ventricle. If we keep going, we say the fourth ventricle's choroid plexus produces cerebral spinal fluid that goes to the fourth ventricle. So you see that fills in those top 3 rows of this chart, and that sort of just makes sense, right? And the names just sort of flow together. And then you could see that, you have that fluid flowing down through these different structures here, eventually entering the venous blood, going to the heart and lungs for oxygen, and then going into the arterial blood and coming back up again. So that's sort of the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, a nice little chart that you'd like to know. Okay, so how does blood reach the brain? We said that brain really relies heavily on oxygen, and how does this blood reach the brain? In other words, blood is carrying that oxygen. So how does this work? Well, really, to nourish the front of the brain, you'll see that you have the carotid arteries that we've spoken about many times before. See them right here again. Entering the posterior part of the brain, you have vertebral arteries. And what they do is they nourish the back part of the brain, right, the posterior side. Also within the brain, what you're going to notice, you have something called the circle of Willis. And that's a very important structure here. And the reason it is, it's almost like a roundabout. Most major U.S. cities don't really have roundabouts. But sometimes you'll see a roundabout. Instead of a four-way intersection with stoplights, you'll see a roundabout, and traffic can flow very slow but very smoothly through that roundabout. And really what the circle of Willis does, again, just sort of circular is very important, is it provides this circular route of blood, and it helps prevent, not that it prevents clots, but if a clot occurs, there's just sort of universal or circular passage of blood through the brain. And so even if there is a clot, although it could be very detrimental, in some sense it helps alleviate the potential danger from a given clot, given that blood can flow in a circular manner throughout the brain. So that's a very important structure, that circle of Willis. Okay, the main veins that enter the brain are the internal jugular veins, right? And then again, that circle of Willis that I mentioned, really helps with that collateral circular route to help prevent against, not prevent against blood clots, right? But if they happen, still help blood reach all areas of the brain that it has to reach. Okay, so speaking of blood and brain, there's something called the blood-brain barrier. We want to think about, what is this? Well, the blood-brain barrier is basically something that prevents unwanted substances from leaving the capillaries and entering into the brain. And how does it prevent unwanted substances from entering into the brain via the capillaries? Well, the epithelial cells that line these capillaries have tight junctions, and they're really tight. In other words, those cells are just, next to each other, almost like soldiers in a row, and they're touching each other to the point where substances are not going to pass between those cells very easily. You also have supporting cells of the central nervous system, astrocytes we've spoken about before. And these astrocytes, what they do is, again, they help contribute to those tight junctions. So what goes through? Well, things like glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide get through, which is really important. Most antibiotics don't get through. Most bacteria don't get through. So you can see that certain things get through, but certain things don't, So it's sort of interesting. If we show you a little visual diagram of this is what it sort of looks like. So on the top portion of the diagram, you have the blood side. That would indicate the capillaries, right? So up here are the capillaries, this sort of little bracketed region. On the bottom, you have the brain, right? So this is sort of inside the brain now. You can see you have those supporting cells, astrocytes. You would also have neurons in there, etc. And then right in the middle, this is sort of the wall of the capillary, and you could see that in that endothelial layer, you have these tight junctions that are preventing things from getting through. And so what this chart is really doing at the top here is just sort of showing you these are some things that can get through, some things that cannot get through, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the things you want, glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, can diffuse back and forth. Things that you don't want to get through, like large proteins, bacteria, things of that nature, typically do not get through, and it's a protective mechanism for the brain. Okay, so now that we talked about the protection and nourishment of the brain, let's move on to the principal parts of the brain, talk about the main structures and functions. Okay, so what are the main parts of the brain? Well, these are a lot of the ones we're going to go through right now, sort of an overview slide. And we're going to talk about them in detail on the following slides. So when we look at it, the first thing we're going to focus on is the brainstem, sort of the bottom portion of the brain over here. And it is composed of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, and really it helps with very basic bodily functions. So survival type things. The next part we're going to focus on is also something called the cerebellum. And again, very basic type body functions. Cerebellum in particular helps to do with movement. We're going to talk about the diencephalon, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. And then finally, we're going to talk about the cerebrum, which is sort of this large structure up here on the superior portion of the brain. And that's really something that's going to have to do with higher level thinking. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are the components of the brainstem? Well, as we mentioned before, we have the medulla, we have the pons, we have the midbrain. Basically, this lower portion of the brain that we call the brainstem is superior and it's continuous to the spinal cord, right? So we see the spinal cord exiting out the bottom here in the inferior direction. It controls many autonomic functions of the nervous system. And it also is a relay station, relaying information basically to other parts of the brain. If someone has issues with their brainstem, that's a life or death situation. Often when someone is in a vegetative coma, for many years, the only part of their brain that is still functioning is the brainstem. So it's keeping them alive, but they're not able to do any higher level functions. Okay, let's go ahead and look at this. So let's focus on the medulla first. So what is the medulla and what does it control? Well, I always think of this movie, The Waterboy. Have you ever seen that with Adam Sandler? It's sort of a funny movie where they constantly talk about the medulla oblongata. But, why are they so fascinated with it? Well, this is sort of why. The medulla basically has these things called ascending and descending tracts from the spinal cord. And what happens is in the gray matter in the medulla, you have very important bodily functions, basic functions, so like the cardiovascular center, the respiratory center, and then just basic bodily functions like sneezing, coughing, things of that nature. So again, just basic survival type things are located in the medulla. If we focus a bit further on the medulla, we can see that we have these things that are called pyramids, right? That are called pyramids. And these are basically bulges that contain the cortical spinal tracts, these descending tracts. And basically at a certain point, we have these things called the decussation of these pyramids. And what this means is it's saying basically, you always hear the saying that the left part of your brain controls the right part of your body and vice versa. And this sort of helps explain that a little bit because you have these tracks, right? You have these tracks crossing over. See how they cross over here from one side of the spinal cord to the other. So that sort of explains that control of the certain parts of the brain with certain parts of the body. Okay. So let's move on to the next part here. What are the pons, right? And what does the pons control? Okay, so here's the pons, right? Just superior to the medulla. And really what it is I think of a bridge. When I think of the pons, so think of like you're crossing a pond, and to cross a pond, you need a bridge, right? I know it's pons and not pond, but you sort of get the idea to help you remember it. And this really connects basically sort of the basic brainstem with the higher level functions of the brain and the cerebrum. And so it's a very important structure. The pon has things called pontine nuclei, and these are relay stations, right? Again, from the cerebellum, right, which is this structure over here, to the cerebrum, which is this structure way at the top here. Okay, and again, what kind of things does it control in terms of bodily functions? Really basic respiration, just helping your body breathe, right? That basic sensation. Okay, next one up the brainstem, the midbrain. What is it, where is it, and what does it control? Well, here's the midbrain, right? So we're going just superior now. And it conveys basic sensory motor impulses, regulates auditory visual reflexes, and helps coordinate some basic muscular movements. There's always some overlap between different structures of the brain. So we always say like this structure of the brain does this does this. We're trying to give you a basic feel for what each structure does, but realize that it's not an all or none thing in some aspects. So in some regards, there is overlap. Just like, let's say the father in a given household might, do the laundry, and the mother might be responsible for cooking dinner, or it could be vice versa, right? Each of those individuals is not only responsible for that, but that's usually what they do, right? And they're the main player in that, but the other person could always help out. That's how I think of the brain too. Okay, some more details on the midbrain. Well, these midbrains have these different structures here called the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, and the cerebral peduncle. And really what this is these are different structures that we're going to focus on in lab later on, and they have different functions that we want to note. So we'll sort of save that explanation for lab a little bit. Okay, next structure of the brain. Let's keep going through here. So it's called the diencephalon. So, where is it and what does it control? Well, the diencephalon surrounds the third ventricle, right? And it contains three different structures. So the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Let's go ahead and look at that. So there's a nice picture sort of showing you that, right? So all that together is the diencephalon with the three different parts. What do they do? Well, the epithalamus secretes melatonin, and melatonin is something that's really valuable in sleep, right? So it helps to determine your sleep cycle. Then we move to the thalamus. What does it do? Well, it's a relay station, right, for different sensory impulses to the cerebral cortex. Everything except for smell, basically. And that's sort of interesting, actually. So different things can wake you up when you're sleeping, right? So for example, if there's an extreme change in temperature or loud noise, it might wake you up when you're sleeping. But smell is not something that wakes you up from sleeping, given that it's not relayed through the thalamus. And that's sort of interesting, and that's why it's important to have a smoke detector in your home. Because if you have smoke accumulating in your house and you're sleeping, that smell, that sensation is not going to wake you up. It's sort of an interesting practical fact. Okay. It also plays a role in awareness and acquisition of knowledge, right? So some role in cognition as well. Let's go on to the final of the three, the hypothalamus. And what does it do? Well, it produces hormones, regulates emotions, hunger, thirst, etc. So a lot of different functions in that regard. Okay, let's start moving into different portions of the brain now. Now we're going to go into the cerebellum, right, which is sort of, posterior to the brainstem. What does it control? Well, it has different functions, right? Coordination, movement, error correction. If you're about to stumble or you're about to trip, the cerebellum is going to help you regain your balance. Helps with muscle tone, posture, those types of things as well. When we look at the cerebellum, you can see that it has two hemispheres, right? So we have a left and we have a right hemisphere. And also what we have is we have this ridge down the middle, and we call it the vermis. It's a very pronounced structure that you'll see. Okay, so let's move on here. Where is the cerebrum, and what does it control? Now, the cerebrum is sort of the large superior portion of the brain, right? So it's very large there. What does it control? Well, this is the seat of our intelligence, and different parts of the cerebrum have a very specific role in different parts of our higher level brain functioning. We're not going to go through every single one today. We're going to save that for a more advanced physiology course. But I'm going to give you some basic structural elements of the cerebrum and some basic functions. Okay, so on the outer portion, you have gray matter, right? So the cerebral cortex, you have gray matter on the outside, you have white matter on the inside for the most part. This is flipped from the spinal cord, right? So on the spinal cord, the gray is on the inside and the white is on the outside. But it's different in the brain. It's the opposite. Okay, in the inner portion of the brain, you have this white matter, as I mentioned, and you have these areas called tracts we're going to talk about. And deep, basically, inside the white matter, you have little tiny spots of gray matter, right? So little tiny spots of gray on the inside. Most of the gray is on the outside, but little tiny spots on the inside. These are called basal nuclei. We're going to talk about these a bit further as well. Okay, and this is what the brain sort of looks like. So you can see that outer gray matter, right? So to see it here on the outside, you could see most of the inside is white matter, but you do have these little tiny gray spots on the inside, right? These basal nuclei that we'll talk about a bit further. Okay, some more details about the cerebrum. You have bumps on the cerebrum, right? These ridges, they're called gyri. You have shallow grooves, right? Indentations that are called sulci or sulci. And these sulci, the way I remember that is if you're down, you're sort of sad, you say you're sulking, right? So sulci are very, these indentations that are grooves that are down in the dumps. You also have fissures, which are deep grooves separating the hemispheres. And this is really what it sort of looks like here. So you could see these gyri, right, these bumps. You could see a sulcus, which is singular, right, and gyrus is singular too. The sulci, these deep grooves or indentations. You can see these fissures, which are these really, really deep grooves, right, separating the hemispheres. You can see we have a very famous fissure right down the middle here called the longitudinal fissure. You have a very famous sulcus here, right, like this, called the central sulcus. And there's other structures you could see as well, right, different lobes to the brain, etc. And we'll tackle those on the next slide. Okay, so what are the lobes that we just mentioned of the cerebrum, and where are they located? What do they control? Well, here are the different lobes here, and if we already covered the bone lecture, which we should have in the bone lab, you're really going to like this because they're identical to what we saw in the bone lab for the most part. So again, if on this side here we have the anterior, right, and over here we have the posterior, right, so they're sort of marked here. You could see that on the front of the brain, or on the anterior side, you have the frontal lobe, okay, just like we talked about before. If we go to the back side, the posterior, we have the parietal lobe. If we keep going posterior, we have the occipital lobe. Sort of by your temples, you have the temporal lobe. And the only one that we didn't really talk about before with bones, right, is something that's deep, right? So it's underneath the temporal lobe. That's why it's cut. It's called the insula. Okay, that's a lobe as well. And you can see the other structures of the brain we talked about before. But these are the main different lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, we also have something called hemispheric lateralization. Sort of an interesting thing. So you hear about it all the time in pop culture, but it is true, right? We talk about the right portion of the brain versus the left, right? And here we're looking down on a brain, so it might not really seem anatomical to you because this brain's not facing us, right? We're looking down at it. So our right is the brain's right, actually, in this case. But really, we talk about the right hemisphere. We think about creative things like musical, artistical awareness that controls that, space and pattern perception, insight, imagination, generating a present image, right? All those types of things we think about. So that's why this picture here, and it looks like it's an ad from Mercedes-Benz that I stole here, so I have no stock in that company, but sort of a nice picture, I thought, sort of showing you this artistic flowing of all these different parts coming out of the brain, right? So that's what we think of with the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, really what it controls are things that are very practical, very logical, right? Very ordered. Think of it that way. So spoken and written language, numerical and scientific skills, organization and perceptions, brain chatter, right? In other words, the production of language. So all those types of things. It's sort of neat. Okay. Let's keep going with the cerebrum a little bit here. Let's talk about those gray spots right inside the white matter and the internal portion of the brain. And those are things that we call basal nuclei. So where are they and what do they do? Well, here you see a picture of the basal nuclei, right? You sort of see them there. What do? They really help with the regulation of the initiation and termination of movements. So if someone has issues with their basal nuclei, they might have issues with things like Parkinson's disease, right? The initiation and termination of movement is not working correctly. And so that's something that you really notice with Parkinson's. Okay, we also have something in the brain called the limbic system. We want to think about what does that do. Well, here's the limbic system here, right? We have different components here. We have one component that is the hippocampus, and it has to do with memory. We have another component called the amygdala. And that portion that we call the amygdala, which you see right here, is something that's really used in emotional responses. So a key one that it emphasizes is something called a fear response. And so you'll see individuals that have overactive amygdala that are hyperactive. That's someone that might be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's sort of interesting. So hippocampus, right, memory, and I think hippos have a good memory. Just helps me remember that. And then amygdala, I think of like the spiritual leader of the Dalai Lama. I think that he's really not afraid of much because he's so calm, right? So he would have maybe a hypoactive amygdala. That's how I distinguish those two structures there. Okay, we also have something called the reticular formation. We want to look at that and talk about what that controls as well. And really, this is a sort of net-like arrangement of neural cell bodies, right? And small little bundles of myelinated axons, again. And really, it has sensory and motor neurons. And it's, again, basically involved in a lot of sensory perception. When we talk about the reticular activating system, just to continue this discussion, really, this is sort of what it looks like. And what it helps regulate is consciousness, right? And so it helps awaken someone from sleep. Okay, this is a nice little summary of the brain. Again, not everything we talked about, but sort of a nice little summary slide to help test yourself. But you want to make sure you know all the different components of the brain that we did discuss throughout this lecture here. Okay, let's go on to the final portion of the lecture. And this is going into those cranial nerves that we talked about. So we want to think about it. So we have 12 cranial nerves, right? 12 pairs. And for each nerve, you want to make sure you remember the number, the Roman numeral number, the name, and then the major function that it does. So what are these cranial nerves, right? And why are they important? Well, really, if we look up a picture, we'll see these cranial nerves are coming basically right out of the brain themselves. And here's a list of them. So whenever you see yellow in any of these pictures, right, where you see here, these are the cranial nerves. So we want to go through them one by one, and we want to make sure for each nerve that we know these three different things. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So what are the names of these 12 cranial nerves, right? And what are their functions? Well, there's a very nice mnemonic that you can use to memorize these. And so here are the nerves in yellow. Again, whenever I show you a picture from here on out, yellow is going to be the cranial nerve, right? How do we remember these names? Well, this is how we remember the names. And this is a very famous mnemonic. I did not make this up myself, but this is very famous. So we want to think on old Olympus towering top, a Finn and German viewed some hops. So each of those letters for each of those words tells you the name of that specific cranial nerve, right? So let's go ahead and look at this here. And so I'm not going to go through and say each nerve. You can read it as I say the mnemonic, but I want to say the mnemonic and have them pop up in the order so you can see what they are. And then we'll go through them one by one. Okay, so on, old, Olympus, towering, top, a Finn and German, viewed some hops. And you can see that each of those letters stand for each of the cranial nerves in a specific order. Now, some of these cranial nerves are just involved in sensory, some are just involved in motor, some are involved in both. And there's a different mnemonic to memorize that, right? Whether it's just sensory, just motor, or both. And this is that mnemonic here for the functions. So it says, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. And again, let's look at how this works here. So for cranial nerve number 1, some, it's just sensory. For cranial nerve number 2, say, it's just sensory. 3, marry is motor. And I won't keep doing this. You sort of get the idea, right? So let's look through it. So some say marry, and then money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Okay, and the B's stand for both, right? Sensory and motor function. Okay, so these mnemonics are going to help you memorize these. So you really want to make sure that you practice these and that you're able to go ahead and say this mnemonic up here for the names, and that you could say these too to help you remember. Is it just sensory function, just motor, or is it both? Okay, let's just go through each of the cranial nerves briefly and tell you what they are. I'll give you a little intro to them. Cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve, and this helps in your sense of smell. And this is sort of how it works. Again, the picture, I'm just going to let you look at it, right? But you could see that the olfactory nerve is coming in to the olfactory bulb, right? So you can see that sort of up here, and it's shown here as well, and that helps with your sense of smell. Let's go on to number 2. Cranial number 2 is the optic nerve, and it helps with your sense of sight, with the actual seeing itself. So not moving the eye muscle, not moving the eye via muscles, not that, but just the sense of sight itself. So helping you see. So not movement of eyes, but helping you see, producing the image. And here you see the optic nerve, right, entering into the posterior part of the eyeball. Okay, the next cranial nerve is going to be cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor. Let's also throw in cranial nerve 4, the trochlear, and then also 6, so we're skipping around, right? But 6 is the abducens. All 3 of these together basically help move the eye. And so that's what it's showing you here in this picture, showing you each of those nerves and how they help move the eye. Different eye muscles. We'll cover these eye muscles in the very near future when we focus on the eye. Okay. The next one, we're backing up one now, right? So cranial nerve number 5, right? Because we skipped that, the trigeminal nerve. And what does this do? This is the major sensory nerve of the face. So whenever you're poking your face or something hits your face, right, this main nerve, which you see right here, and then it branches in different areas, that helps you feel that. Okay. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. This is the main motor nerve of the face that helps control facial expressions. So it's sort of akin to the last one we talked about, but this is for motor, right? So it helps you, with all of the movement of the muscles in your face. Okay, how about cranial nerve number 8? This is the auditory nerve. And what auditory helps you do is it's for hearing and then equilibrium and balance, right? So you could see that auditory nerve entering into the ear canal right there. How about cranial nerve number 9? It's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. Remember, glossa in Greek stands for tongue. Okay, so what does this do? Well, it helps aid in swallowing, saliva production. That's the motor part of it. This nerve does both, motor and sensory. The sensory part is for taste, right, or the sensation of swallowing. And so you could see this nerve sort of here innervating that portion of the body. How about cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, the wanderer? So vagus means the wanderer, sort of not loyal, sort of just meandering back and forth. So a very appropriate word for Las Vegas, right, when you think about it. But so cranial nerve 10, right, is the vagus nerve. And what does it do? It carries out most of the parasympathetic motor neuron functions, right? So in other words, when you're eating, you need to digest, right? So rest and digest. You could see that vagus nerve, right, that's the glossopharyngeal, but here's the vagus nerve right here. That's going to be involved in all of those functions, the rest and digest. So it, helps innervate the stomach. It has a role in reducing heart rate, all of these things. There's many different branches here that are affecting all those rest and digest responses that we've actually referred to in previous lectures. But now you see the nerve that controls it, the vagus nerve. Okay, we're almost done, right? 2 more. Cranial nerve 11. It's called the spinal accessory nerve. And really this just helps you control your shoulders shrugging, right? And so to help me remember this one, I think of a person facing you, right? So sort of like this. They're just sort of facing you. Say they're smiling, right? There's their eyes. You can barely see it. Okay. I think of this. It's number 11, right? So if it's number 11, I think of we have a 1 here, a 1 here. They're pointing down to your shoulders. It's helping you shrug your shoulders. So number 11 helps you shrug your shoulders. That's what I think of. Okay. The last one here. So number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. What does this do? It helps with speech, chewing, swallowing. Again, you have that word glossa on there, right? We don't want to confuse it with the other one, but your tongue is obviously helping with these functions. And this is that nerve here as well. So that's a nice little, sort of introductory lesson to all the different cranial nerves as well. So you want to know the 12, you want to know the names, you want to know the functions. Okay, so this was our lecture on the nervous system, brain and cranial nerves, right? We talked about protection, nourishment of the brain. You want to be able to describe that, how it works. We also talked about the main principal parts of the brain. We also talked about the 12 cranial nerves. Again, before you proceed to the next lecture, you want to make sure you can execute these learning objectives. If you have difficulty with them, it's not a problem. Just re-listen to this lecture before you proceed to the next one.